I'll do it here. Okay. So I think it's fair to say that on any phonetician's to-do list, there are at least two aspects. One is to characterize the defining properties of speech sounds that occur in natural language. And the other one is to figure out how the listener extracts these properties in the process of speech perception. So we're talking about acoustic cues, what are they, and how do listeners extract them from the speech signal. Now you could start very simply. You could say, okay, let's just look at one cue and see what happens. So we do that here. In this particular case, we're looking at spectral mean frequency. Where is my cursor? Spectral mean frequency along the... Is there a pointer here or anything that I can use? I don't know how these things are. Okay, anyway. Along the horizontal axis here, the spectral mean, going from low to high frequencies, you have two distributions, one for, thank you very much, thank you. One for alveolar S and one for post-alveolar sh. Okay, you see that in general the alveolar S have higher spectral means and the post-alveolar sh has lower spectral mean, but you also see an area of overlap. So this one particular cue won't do a very good job in distinguishing two classes of sounds. And simplifying things a little bit, this is basically how the first 25 years of phonetic research post-World War II went about its business, just focusing on one cue at a time. Now, of course, we can say that's just one cue. Of course, it doesn't do a very good job. What happens when we add another cue and we look at two cues? And we do that here. And now we have added to spectral mean along the horizontal axis, we have added F2 frequency of the vowel following the fricative along the vertical axis. And you see you get better separation of the two clouds of points, but there is still some overlap. And then you could say, well, that's only two cues. What if we add a lot more cues? Surely separation must be perfect at some point. And the answer is we tried it, and the answer is no, it doesn't get perfect. We tried to include as many as 24 cues, okay? And we'll talk more about these cues later, but this is kind of a generous sampling of spectral cues, temporal cues, amplitude cues, and so on. And even with 24 cues, you don't get perfect separation of the different classes of fricatives in this particular case. And that led us, and us here is Bob and Murray, and in this particular case, to adopt an approach that was originally developed for articulatory gestural overlap, and that is parsing. And parsing is simply a way of basically parsing the components of the variability and assign them to their underlying sources where they came from. So the idea is if you have all this variability in the speech signal and you can assign different pieces of the variability to their underlying sources, then you might be left with a more nearly invariant representation. So that's the idea that we followed up, and we came up with a model. Models have to have acronyms. We call it CQ, computed cues relative to expectations. And the idea is that the listener keeps track of the speaker and of the vowel, okay, and then sets up expectations based on that speaker, on that vowel. So basically what the listener is dealing with is not so much the speech signal per se, but the difference between the incoming speech signal and the expectations that have been built up for that particular speaker and that particular vowel. So just to give you an idea how that works, our baseline here, the performance that we're trying to mimic is not perfect recognition, but human listener recognition. So when we look at fricative perception, English fricatives in human listeners, they get about 91% correct overall. Okay. If we then try to model that with different cue sets, we get the following pattern. Here we look at an invariance model. We actually didn't find any acoustic cues that were truly invariant, but we found some that were nearly invariant. If we feed those 9 invariant, nearly invariant cues to the model, we get the following pattern. The solid line here is listener performance for each of the fricatives. The green line is how well the model does when we feed it those 9 acoustic cues, and it is about 50% or so below human listener performance. So it doesn't do a very good job. Then we can go up to the 24 cues that I mentioned earlier, and we get better performance by the model. Okay, we go up from 9 to 24 cues, and we go up in terms of recognition accuracy by about 5%. Okay, but we still don't quite capture it the way human listeners do. And then finally, when we use those same 24 cues, but we parse them the way I described earlier, we actually get very good human listener-like behavior, as you see here. And we also match, which you don't see here, the particular types of confusion and the particular vowel context effects. So that's the kind of parsing work that we have been doing to try to understand the relation between acoustics and perception. Now today, I want to talk about a number of additional variables that we have to take into account in this overall process of trying to understand the relation between production and perception. So I want to talk a little bit about the effects of linguistic context. I want to talk about contributions of visual, facial information. I want to compare clear speech to plain speech. And finally, also talk about the effect of language inventory, language background. Okay, I'm sure there's a forwarder on this thing too, but we keep going this way. So first we start with our acoustics, of course, or not, maybe not of course, but I usually start with the acoustics and then work from there. So our database consists of a number of fricative vowel syllables. As you see here, it has all the 8 different fricatives in initial position, English fricatives, followed by 6 different vowels. They're spoken by 20 speakers. Okay? Fricatives offer a nice test case, I think, because they vary along so many dimensions. Of all the speech sounds in English, they actually occur at the most places of articulation. So we have the labiodentals, the interdentals. Those together also make up the class of non-sibilants with a less loud noise component. Then we have the alveolars and the post-alveolars that together make up the class of sibilants with a greater noise component. And then, of course, we have half of them being voiceless and half of them being voiced. I shouldn't say, of course, because I realize that's not true in Korean. You don't have any voice fricatives. We'll get to that later today. Okay. Here are some of those acoustic measures again. Again, we don't have to go into this in detail. This is just to convince you that most acoustic cues that have been described in the literature as potential cues to fricatives were included in our research. So again, spectral cues, amplitude cues, temporal cues. So what do we get out of acoustic studies like this? What does it look like? I'll just give you a quick flavor. If you look at something like spectral peak frequency, and we look at this for the 4 different places of articulation in English, we find, as we had seen earlier already, that the post-alveolars are characterized by a very low spectral peak frequency, so they are very distinct. The alveolars are kind of in between, but the labiodentals and the interdentals are really not different in terms of spectral peak frequency. They overlap, okay? And we find the same when we look at a number of other cues. Here, for example, we look at an amplitude cue. We have the amplitude of the fricative noise here. We have the amplitude of the falling vowel here, and then we can take a difference to normalize. And you see in general that we find that sibilant fricatives are much louder than non-sibilant fricatives, but we cannot really use amplitude to distinguish within either of those 2 groups. And the same is true for duration. If we look at fricative duration, which we have listed here, and we normalize it with respect to word duration, we see again that sibilant fricatives are longer than non-sibilant fricatives, but again, within each of those groups, we can't really differentiate the 2. Okay. What happens in perception? Well, we took a subset of our stimuli, we presented them to listeners, only the fricative portion, show you just their sh, and things like that, okay? And listeners had to identify which fricatives they heard, which fricative they heard. And what we found was that here you have the stimuli that were presented along the leftmost column, and along the row here, the top row, you have the responses that our listeners gave. Correct responses are along the diagonal in bold. Okay, there's a lot of numbers there. But the main thing that I want you to take away from this is that, in general, identification of the sibilant fricatives is highly accurate. Okay, that's down there in that quadrant. Whereas identification of the non-sibilant fricatives is quite poor. Okay, and when we're looking at confusions, we see that confusions are typically made within the class of non-sibilants. So we have a F here that is misperceived as 22% of the time. Okay, there's very few sibilants that are misperceived for non-sibilants, or non-sibilants that are misperceived for sibilants. Okay, so perception is complicated. These non-sibilant fricatives are quite poorly recognized. We also saw that acoustically they're quite poorly defined. It's hard to find features that really distinguish these 2 places of articulation. And that's all consistent with an earlier claim by Miller and Nicely. Miller and Nicely had a classic paper back in 1955 in which they looked at consonant confusions in noise, okay? And they basically gave up on labiodentals and dentals, and they said, the distinctions between th, this is a quote from their paper, the distinctions between th and th and between the and the are among the most difficult for listeners to hear. And it seems likely that in most natural situations, the differentiation depends more on verbal context and on visual observation of the talker's lips than it does on the acoustic difference. And so that's a claim that was made now more than 60 years ago, but it actually wasn't investigated in very much detail until we started looking at that now also quite a few years ago, but not as far back as 1955. Okay. So, effects of verbal context, as Miller nicely mentioned. Nowadays we would say effective linguistic context. Okay. Now, of course, since 1955, a lot of psycholinguistic research has been done. And we now know that if we look at recognition of particular phonemes or particular words, that recognition is much more quick and much more accurate when that target occurs in a related context as compared to an unrelated context. And that relation can be in a semantically related context, it can be in a phonologically related context, for example. And a nice early example of that work was a small study done by Garnes and Bond. They created a b to d to g place of articulation continuum by varying the second form of frequency. Okay. And then to the members of that b to d to g continuum, they added the codon 8. So essentially what they did was they created a bait to date to gate continuum. Okay. They then inserted the members of that bait to date to gate continuum in various context sentences. These contexts were, here's the fishing gear and the blank, check the time and the blank, and paint the fence and the blank. So you see where this is going. These sentences are set up semantically such that they fit well with one of the three words, right? So here's the fishing gear and the bait, check the time and the date, paint the fence and the gate. Those would be good matches, okay? So you as a listener in this experiment would be listening to these different sentences with the different continuum members at the end, and you had to report which word you heard. Now what they found, Garnes and Bond, was that if you had acoustic tokens that were completely unambiguous, clear b, clear d, clear g, they were perceived as such regardless of the particular sentence context in which they occurred. Okay, so when you had a clear b, listeners were perfectly happy to report that they heard paint the fence and the bait, for example. Okay, but of course the interesting part comes where the stimuli are acoustically more ambiguous. Okay, so when you have something in between a b and a d, for example. And in those cases, you saw sentence context coming in, and listeners would make an effort to report that particular word that made semantic sense given the context. So if they heard something, if they were presented with something between a b and a d, they would report in hearing a b in here's the fishing gear and the bait, but they would report hearing a d and check the time and the date. Okay? So sentence context had a clear effect on acoustically ambiguous tokens. Now, in our study of these non-sibilant fricatives, we were inspired by that, but we also realized that we didn't necessarily have to manipulate our tokens. We didn't have to make a continuum of sounds, for example, but rather we could exploit the inherent difference in salience between the sibilant and non-sibilant fricatives. So what we're dealing with here is that fricatives such as th and th are acoustically highly confusable. I just showed you that earlier. There's no clear acoustic cues. They're hard to distinguish perceptually, whereas fricatives like s and sh are acoustically distinct and quite robust. So the question then is, how does sentence context interact with this inherent difference in salience? So what we did was we came up with minimal fricative word pairs, so something like thirst and first, or something like shave and save. We created congruent and incongruent sentence conditions. So for example, the lemonade quenched my thirst would be perfectly good. The top swimmer came in first. The barber gave Edith shave. $10 was all she could save. Okay, those are all congruous readings. And then we just switched the sentences to come up with the incongruent conditions. So now, of course, the top swimmer came in thirst, or the lemonade quenched my thirst would not be a semantically congruous sentence. Okay, so in our experiment then, our listeners would hear these sentences and they just had to report what was the fricative of the final target word that they heard. when we look at their results, here we have accuracy, okay, for each of the 4 different fricatives, depending on whether they were presented in a semantically congruous or incongruous condition. Okay? And we find an effect of sentence context, but only for the non-sibilant fricatives. So for the non-sibilant fricatives, people are much more accurate in the congruous condition compared to the incongruous condition. But for the sibilant fricatives, people are near ceiling all the way across. They do well regardless of the matching or mismatching sentence context. However, when we look at reaction time as a more sensitive measure of processing, we find that sentence context actually has an effect for the perception of all fricatives. Okay? So not only do we find again that sentence congruity effect for the labiodentals and the interdentals, but we also find it for the sibilant fricatives right here. Okay? So in terms of Miller and Nicely's claim, we find here that sentence context, or verbal context as they call it, does have an effect, but not only for acoustically ambiguous tokens. What about the second part, the effect of facial cues? And I should mention that this is a study we did with Yu Wang, who was a graduate student at the time, and Brian Kim, who was an undergraduate student at the time. And so now what we did was we focused on the non-sibilant fricatives. There's another classic paper that came out at about the time that Miller and Nicely came out, Pollack and Sumby, that Dennis Burnham already briefly referred to this morning. And what they had shown was that the contribution of visual information increases as auditory distinctiveness decreases. Okay? So what we did here is we looked at th, the, th, and the, paired with 3 vowels, and we presented these in 3 conditions. Okay, so either audio-visual, you heard the token, you saw the speaker's face, audio only, video only. What did we find? We found in general that perception based on audio-visual information was very good. Perception based on audio information only was less good, but quite good. And as you can see here, the gray bars, perception based on just video only information was quite poor. Okay. Does that mean that there's no visual information as a signal? Not necessarily. When we looked at the kinds of errors that our perceivers made, we found that those errors were largely due to errors in terms of voicing. Okay. And we know you can't really read voicing off a speaker's face, off the lips. Okay. So when we correct for that and we just score in terms of place of articulation, disregarding errors in terms of voicing, we get actually very good recognition in the video-only modality. In fact, it's just as good as in the audio-visual modality, and both are better than audio-only. So there's definitely a lot of visual information present in the signal. So what we find, coming back to Miller and Nicely's original 1955 claim, we find here that linguistic context does affect perception of all fricatives, not only the acoustically more ambiguous fricatives. And we find that visual information is not merely a helpful cue, or it helps you out when there's a noisy situation, but it's an integral part of speech perception. There was no noise in this particular case. Okay. So that's one aspect. Another way to dig more into the relation between perception and production of fricatives in this particular case is to make comparisons between plain speech, or conversational speech as it's often called, and clear speech. So what we want to know here, of course, is whether speakers make systematic changes in their production of clearly produced fricatives. And if they do, what kind of acoustic modifications do they make? What is it that they do that makes these fricatives more clear? And we like to work on clear speech because it may reveal those acoustic properties that are most crucial to efficient and optimal speech communication, right? So if you have to repeat a word and you have to sort of enhance its intelligibility, then presumably you put all your effort into enhancing those particular features that are most important in getting your message across. Okay. So again, we start with an acoustic study. This started as a dissertation by Kazumi Maniwa, and also with Travis Wade, who was also a graduate student at KU at the time. We had a new corpus, 20 speakers again, but now we had these fricatives in intervocalic position, so afa, asha, and things like that. And then they were recorded in, of course, critically, both plain conversational style and clear speaking style. And for the clear speaking style, we kind of had, I think, a pretty unique approach here. The way in which we elicited the clear productions, we introduced a computerized recognition system that would guess which syllables were spoken. So we would tell our participants, okay, we are working on some speech recognition software. It's pretty good, but it's not perfect. So occasionally we'll make an error. And when it makes an error, could you please correct it and repeat your production more clearly? Okay, so a trial may look something like this. You're sitting in the soundproof room. You get a prompt that says, please say asa. You produce asa. This is your conversational, your plain production. Okay. The computer then says, did you say asa? Please say asa again. So now you have to correct for this voicing error, and you say asa. And whatever you do, presumably you'll make an effort to make that a lot clearer. And so that's our clear production. Now, in reality, of course, there was no speech recognition software whatsoever. We had just set up our program to systematically make these speakers believe certain misperceptions were taking place. So, of course, it could be a correct response. The computer asks you to say asa. You say asa. The computer says, great, let's move on. Okay? But in the other cases, we had either something that matched in place but mismatched in voicing. So you were supposed to say asa, well you did say asa, the computer thought that you said asa, and now you have to repeat that asa, correcting for that voicing error. And in the other case, of course, you have to repeat it, but now correct for that place error. So you said asa, the computer thinks you said afa, and you have to correct for that particular place order. So we get systematically different productions in response to different perceived miscommunications. Okay, what do we find? Well, up to that point, most research on clear speech had looked at, which I sometimes call the easy acoustic measures. They had looked at duration, voice onset time, speaking rate, and things like that. So just to give you an idea, we do replicate those earlier findings. We find, not surprisingly, that clearly produced fricatives are a lot longer than plain fricatives, about 3 times as long. We find that if you look at the fundamental frequency of the vowels surrounding the fricatives, it is higher in clear productions than in plain productions. But we also did a lot of work on detailed spectral measurements, and that was kind of new in the clear speech domain at the time. I'm just going to give you one example here. There's a lot of data on this slide. There's 8 different panels, one per fricative. On each panel, you'll have 5 different measurement locations, kind of a window marching through the fricative, and then spectral peak frequency along the vertical axis. The key thing to note is that on each panel, the clear production data is in the solid line, and the plain is in the dashed line. The key thing to note is that overall, we always find higher spectral peak locations for clearly produced fricatives than for plain produced fricatives, with the exception of the post-alveolar start here. So this is just one example. We did a lot of different acoustic measures. I'm not going to take you through all of that. What we did do was we looked at a discriminant analysis for place of articulation. So the idea there is, how well can we classify the fricatives into their respective places of articulation based on acoustics fed to the model from plain productions versus clear productions. And we do find an advantage for the clear productions. For most, it's not a big effect, but it's there. And it's there for most of the cues. Most of the cues give us better recognition based on clear fricative productions than on plain fricative productions. So that, of course, leads to the following question. That's all well and good, but are clearly produced fricatives actually more intelligible? Okay, whatever people do, does that make them more intelligible? And if it does, can we look at which particular acoustic modifications they made so that their productions did become more intelligible? So that's what we looked at next. In this particular case, then we took our asas and afas and so on. We embedded it in multi-speaker babble noise, okay? And then our stimuli were blocked, so you as a participant in a particular run, you maybe just had to look at a voicing pair and decide whether something was f or v, or th or the, or you had a place pair and you had to decide whether something was f or th, and so on. And this, of course, done both for clear productions and for plain productions. It's kind of a method of adjustment where we start with a particular signal-to-noise ratio. So the first token is presented to you. If you get it right, we make the task harder. We decrease the signal-to-noise ratio. If you get it wrong, we make the task easier. We increase the signal-to-noise ratio. And we settle for a signal-to-noise ratio at which you get about 75% correct. So that signal-to-noise ratio then is our dependent variable. what we find overall is that we get a lower threshold for clear fricatives. So we pull that speech intelligibility enhancement out. People do about better by about 3 decibels on clear fricatives than on plain fricatives. When we look at that in more detail, looking at different pairings, we have here a number of place pairings first, and then a number of voice pairings second. We do find the clear fricative benefit across, so there's no doubt about that. Overall, we find that sibilants benefit more from clear speech than non-sibilants, and we also find that clear speech gave us similar benefits both for place distinctions and for voicing distinctions. Okay, then the question is, of course, okay, now that we've established that these clear fricatives are more intelligible, what is it in the acoustic signal that leads to that greater intelligibility? Okay, and there what we did was we calculated the clear plane difference for each acoustic measure for each speaker. Then we calculated the clear plane intelligibility difference for each speaker, and then we correlated the two. And we found strong positive correlations between this intelligibility advantage and a number of acoustic cues that you see here: higher spectral peak location, higher spectral mean, more positive spectral tilt, steeper spectral slopes. So what all these acoustic modifications have in common is that they shift energy to the higher frequencies. And when you shift energy to the higher frequency, it helps you make place of articulation distinctions. Okay, now I mentioned earlier that the particular way in which we had rigged this fake speech recognition software gave us a great opportunity to look at different ways in which our speakers produce their clear tokens, depending on whether they were made to believe that a minimal pair confusion took place. Okay, so what we asked here was, are differences between values for minimal pairs larger in productions following minimal pair confusions? What does it mean? Well, what it means is, if you think about a contrasted production, the way we think about it, for example, you had to produce f, okay? The speech recognition algorithm misperceived it as a v, and you now have to come back and produce a clearer v, okay? So it's really looking at f when it was misperceived as v, and at v when it was misperceived as f, okay? The non-contrasted productions are just f being misperceived as anything but v, and v being misperceived as anything but f, okay? So what do we find there in those particular cases? I'll give you 2 examples. Here's a difference in, we're looking at the pair f-v, and we're looking at the amount of low frequency energy. Now, low frequency energy is a good indicator of voicing because, of course, vocal fold vibration contains a lot of low frequency energy. So if we look at our plain productions right here, we see that our speakers in plain productions make about a 4 decibel difference between a voice and a voiceless fricative, between a f and a v. So they distinguish the two. Okay? Then the key thing to realize is that both of these bars represent clear productions. So in their clear productions, they make that difference bigger. It now becomes 6 or 7 decibels. But most crucially, the difference is even bigger in the minimal pair confusions than in the other confusions. Okay, so when you have to produce a f and specifically distinguish it from a v, or the other way around, you make an even larger difference than when you have to distinguish that f from just about anything else. And here's another example. Here we're looking at the s-sh distinction, okay, and we're looking at the first spectral moment, the spectral mean, okay. In plain productions, speakers make about a 2500 Hz difference between these two, okay. In clear productions, they make a much larger difference, and crucially, in their contrasted productions, they make an even greater difference. So when they have to produce a s in response to a sh, or a sh in response to a s, they enlarge that difference even more. Okay. So what have we found so far talking about clear speech? Well, we've seen that clear fricatives show both global enhancement, making things overall longer, making things louder and things like that, as well as contrast-specific enhancements, what I just showed you, these responses in these productions in response to specific misperceptions. And in terms of intelligibility, we found that clearly produced fricatives are more discriminable than plain fricatives for both place of articulation and for voicing. And we saw that increased place of articulation accuracy is due to a shift of energy to the higher frequencies. We then decided to branch out in one more way, and that is to look at what happens when you have a particular hearing impairment. Okay, is clear speech a useful strategy when speaking with hearing impaired listeners? And it's kind of an interesting question because when, not in our paradigm, but in many other labs, when you're trying to elicit clear speech, we often tell our speakers, speak like you're speaking to a hearing impaired person. And the other one is, of course, speak as if you're speaking to an elderly person. Okay. So does this actually help this clear speech for hearing impaired listeners? The thing with a hearing impairment is, of course, that it's a sort of a conflation of a lot of different components. You could have reduced dynamic range, you could have reduced frequency selectivity, you could have impaired temporal resolution. All these things are probably at play in a hearing impairment. So what we chose to do was actually have a simulated hearing impairment. That means you use regular, healthy hearing adults, but you simulate the hearing impairment by filtering the signal in a particular way. And that allowed us to look at a specific aspect that we were, of course, particularly interested in, which is not surprisingly the difficulty in hearing the higher frequencies. So we followed more in Glassberg and implemented a hearing loss that started gradually up to about 1500 hertz and then increased up to about 4500 hertz. So we did the same experiment, we played the stimuli, and what we find is the following. So this is the data now for our simulated hearing loss listeners, okay? And what you see is that they show an advantage, okay, for the sibilant fricatives right here, okay? So they show a clear speech benefit for the sibilant fricatives, but they do not show a clear speech benefit at all, in fact, slightly in the opposite direction for the non-sibilant fricatives. When we compare our normal hearing listeners and our simulated hearing listeners, we see the following. Okay, we see that in fact there is an increase in clear speech benefit for sibilants, for our simulated hearing loss patients, sorry, not patients, listeners. Okay, so they do really well on clear speech for the sibilants, actually even better than the normal hearing listeners. They benefit more from the clear speech signal, but as you see, they don't do well for the non-sibilant fricatives. Okay, so what do we find? Well, we find overall then for clear speech, the clear fricatives are more intelligible for normal hearing and simulated hearing impaired listeners. We find for normal hearing listeners that sibilants were more intelligible than non-sibilants, and this effect was enhanced in clear speech. But of course, for our simulated hearing impaired listeners, we found a clear speech benefit was only obtained for the sibilants, and clear speech was actually detrimental for the non-sibilants. So what we find in general is that the more clear speech modifications involved higher frequency acoustic information, the less effective they were for our simulated hearing impaired listeners. Okay. So what have we talked about so far? We've seen that in general, linguistic context helps perception. We've seen that visual information, facial cues, helps perception. And we've seen that clear speech helps perception, but it is, of course, modulated by the particular population of listeners that you're dealing with. So in the final set of experiments, I want to talk about a number of additional variables that we also have to begin to take into account. And many of you already have. I just got to that stage a little later. So one thing that we have to take into account is the role of language background. So far we've been talking about English fricatives produced and perceived by English listeners. But of course in many cases, such as here today, we're dealing with a variety of language backgrounds, and does that have an effect at all? And we have some indication of that. There's work in the literature, of course, too. Some of our own work has hinted at that too. So we have looked at the English tense-lax vowel distinction, okay? And we have looked at that in native English perceivers and also in non-native Mandarin perceivers. And what we find is that when we look at clear productions, our native English speakers do better on the tense-lax distinction, okay? But when we look at our non-native Mandarin listeners, they are not able to exploit those clear speech enhancements, okay? So what this means is, of course, that clear speech is not necessarily more intelligible. It can be intelligible for one more intelligible for one population, but depending on your L1 background, it may not help you at all in a different population. So that's one thing that we should start looking at. And when we're looking at multimodal perception and we're including the visual modality, then we also have to start thinking about the role of visual salience per se. Okay, so it may be the case that facial cues may only benefit those sounds with a more anterior articulation. It can be easier read of the lips. So those are some things that we wanted to look at. And so the idea is that the ability to benefit from clear speech in different modalities, audio-visual, audio and visual, depends on the auditory and visual cues in the native language, and of course the auditory and visual salience of the target sounds. So what we do here is we combine pretty much everything that I've been talking about so far. We're combining clear speech and plain speech. We're going to be comparing auditory and visual modalities. And we're looking at different L1 inventories. And finally, we're looking at fricatives again. You won't be surprised by this point. And they are particularly good test case because they have inherent differences in the auditory and visual salience, right? So sibilants have high auditory salience, they're acoustically robust, but they have lower visual salience because they're produced further back in the vocal tract. On the other hand, we can look at non-sibilants, which are visually very salient because they're right up front, but as we've already seen, acoustically, they're much less robust. So does that play a role at all in our multimodal perception? So what we wanted to know is, of course, are clear fricatives more intelligible when we add visual information? Does the extent of the clear speech benefit on this visual and or auditory salience? And does the L1 phoneme inventory affect this process at all? Okay. So this is a study that we did with Sylvia Cho. She's a graduate student at Simon Fraser University, working there with Yue Wang, who's on the faculty there, and then also with my colleague Joan Serino, who is here in the audience. And our target is, again, English fricatives produced by native speakers of English, but now we're looking at native English perceivers, and we're looking at two groups of non-native perceivers, Mandarin perceivers and Korean perceivers. And these groups were, of course, not picked at random, but they were picked because of their particular fricative inventories. So when you look at the fricative inventories, by now I'm sure you know exactly what the English fricative inventory looks like. We have all these 8 fricatives that you see there on the top row. But then the first thing to notice is that neither Mandarin nor Korean has any voice fricative, only have voices fricatives. Mandarin has one non-sibilant fricative, f, right here, and then both se and sh. Korean, shocking, I don't know how you get through the day, doesn't have any non-sibilant fricatives whatsoever, and then has one sibilant fricative right here. Okay, so there's a difference in inventory play a role. Okay. We had a number of native English perceivers, Mandarin perceivers and Korean perceivers, a lot of numbers up there, mainly to show you that our non-native perceivers were sort of intermediate English proficiency. Stimuli were again the fricatives in initial position this time, followed by the vowel ah. They were produced by 4 English speakers, 2 males, 2 females, in plain and clear speech, and the clear speech was elicited in the same way as I described earlier with that computer recognition algorithm. And then, of course, stimuli presented in audio-visual, visual-only, and audio-only modes. Okay, and the audio was embedded in multi-talker battle noise. And we piloted this a little bit. We were looking for about an error rate of about 25% so that we could look at differences. And what we found was that we had to embed the sibilants in a signal-to-noise ratio of about -9 decibels and the non-sibilants in a signal-to-noise ratio of 0 decibels. So that's what we did to get comparable error rates. Now I'm going to give you an example of one particular token. So you're going to be hearing or seeing a fricative vowel syllable. Okay, it's the same syllable 3 times in audio, video, and audio-video modes, and you can get a sense of what that looks like and what it sounds like. Okay, it's going to be a quiz afterwards. Now how do I get, do you see a cursor there? Should I just press it? No? Oh, you gave the answer. It's all right. I have to go back up 2 and then...
Do you need sound?
There's sound, but I want to go 1 slide earlier. Yeah, now did you have that? That's the first one. Thank you. Here's the second one. And then here's audio, video together. Any ideas what this may have been if you didn't see the answer? Okay, so this was sa, and it was, in this particular case, a plain token, not a clear token. Just to give you, so this is a mini version of the experiment. Okay, so what did we find? Well, here are results. Of course, a lot of information on one slide, so I'll try to talk to you through that, highlight some of the findings. We have 3 panels for 3 different groups of listeners: English listeners, Mandarin listeners, and Korean listeners. We have the data split in terms of sibilants and non-sibilants, and then of course we have the 3 modalities: audio, visual, audio only, video only, and then we have plain versus clear productions. So let's start with audio only, and let's see what's going on there. Well, for audio only, we get a clear speech benefit, okay, for the native English perceivers, for both sibilant and non-sibilant fricatives. So the benefit simply shows up by the clear bars being higher than the plain bars, right? They do better on clear speech than they do on plain speech. And this is true for both the sibilant fricatives, but also for the non-sibilant fricatives, for the native English perceivers. But when we look at the non-native perceivers, the Mandarin and the Korean perceivers, they show a clear speech benefit, but they only show it for the sibilant fricatives, and they do not show it for the non-sibilant fricatives. And this makes sense, and this is consistent with work, for example, by Fenwick and colleagues at Marx in Sydney, who also showed that you get this clear speech benefit sometimes for non-native distinctions, only for those distinctions that are acoustically quite salient. So what they showed in their particular case, they were looking at recognition by Australian perceivers of stops in Sindhi, and they found that the more salient voicing distinction was perceived and showed a clear speech benefit, but the more subtle place distinction did not show a clear speech benefit at all. So that's what we show here too. Remember that the non-sibilant fricatives are acoustically not that stable, but they are visually very salient. And the sibilants are acoustically very strong, and so in the clear speech enhancement, our non-native speakers can pick up on these. So you see an advantage for the sibilants, but not for the non-sibilants. Now, if we look at the video-only mode, we can see as clear speech enhancement for all 3 listener groups, the English, the Mandarin, and the Koreans, but only in the video-only mode. Okay, so again, that makes sense. You find enhancement in the audio mode for the sibilants, which are acoustically very clearly defined, okay? And you find enhancement for the non-sibilants in the video-only mode, because those are visually very clearly defined. So that makes sense. You kind of latch onto what is most prominent, and what is most prominent gets enhanced even more when you produce clear speech versus plain speech. Okay. Now I'm going to focus to look a little bit more at specific effects of language background. I'm going to focus on the video-only mode. Now remember, in video only, you cannot read voicing, so I'm going to collapse across voicing. Just look at place of articulation, and then particularly at the places that are up front that can be easily lip-read. So we're looking at video only here, plain video only on the top, clear video only on the bottom, for labiodental interdentals for the 3 different perceivers groups. And what you see here is that for the labiodentals, the Koreans don't do as well as the English and the Mandarin perceivers. Okay? And that makes sense because, as we saw, a Korean doesn't have any labiodental fricatives. However, in the clear productions, they actually managed to exploit the clear speech enhancements that the stimuli contain, and they're now up at the same level as the English and the Mandarin perceivers. Now, when we look at the interdentals, what we find there is that the English and the Korean listeners do very well, and the Mandarin perceivers actually do less well. Okay. Now, recall that Mandarin has a labiodental fricative, but it doesn't have an interdental fricative. So what we think is going on here is an effect of L2 assimilation. This has been documented quite well in the literature by Kathy Best and colleagues, that if you have to identify or classify an unknown sound, you usually assimilate it to the sound that is closest to it. So I think that's what's going on here. And Mandarin listeners are faced with an interdental. They don't have an interdental. They classify it as the nearest thing, which is the labiodental. And notice that they also don't recover from that when we go from plain speech to clear speech. They still are at a disadvantage here. Okay, conclusions. These we saw earlier already. Sentential context helps perception. Visual information helps perception. Clear speech helps, but we have to modify it a little bit. The benefits are modulated by signal saliency and nativeness. Okay? And I think it's perhaps helpful to couch that in the well-known distinction that is often made between signal-based and code-based enhancement. For example, Bradlow and Bent talk about that quite a bit in a series of their papers. Now, it's easily intuitive what signal enhancements are, I think. That relates to enhancements in terms of frequency, in terms of duration, in terms of intensity. So these are global signal enhancements where you might, for example, slow down your speaking rate, you increase your vocal effort, and things like that. And then code-based enhancement is more specific. Then we're dealing with the system of phonological contrast and our phonetic realization. So these are language specific, language particular. So I think that what we're seeing here, and not only we but other groups as well, is that signal-based enhancement increases the overall salience of the signal, right? So we saw that across the board. Clear speech helps sibilants in auditory only and non-sibilants in video only. You simply enhance that part which is already intrinsically more robust for that particular distinction. Okay. Now, code-based enhancements, you have to be a little bit careful sometimes. What you want to do is you want to increase the distance between contrasting categories, but of course you don't want to go that far that you start having confusions, right? So if you apply global enhancements, you make everything longer, you may actually ruin the contrast between certain categories. So there are certain constraints on the process. And what we see is that non-speakers are not always able to exploit these code-based benefits. Okay. And we also saw that the L1 phone-in inventory affects multimodal clear perception. Now, what we have here then is, of course, an interplay between signal-based and code-based effects. Clear fricatives are longer and louder. Okay. We can see specific code-based modifications depending on the feedback that our perceivers received. Signal-based enhancements are not always beneficial, right? So think about the simulated hearing impairment listeners. Clear speech was actually detrimental for them, for the non-sibilants. So signal-based enhancements are typically global, but they actually can sometimes help non-native listeners break the native code. Okay, so we saw that perception of visually salient fricatives tends to be more susceptible to an L1 influence, but they can also benefit from clear speech enhancement. So what we're doing currently then is, just to finish up in the last minute that I have, is we're doing two things. We're exploring what the facial cues are that improve intelligibility, right? So we get better recognition based on clear speech in the visual-only modality. Where does it come from? We know now where that comes from acoustically. Well, what about in the visual modality? So what we're doing is we're using computer vision and imaging processing techniques to track facial movement, to get a clear picture of what's going on, what are doing people differently in their clear productions than in their plain productions visually. And we're also trying to, how shall I say it, make our modeling efforts better. So if you think about our CQ approach, where we're trying to relate acoustics to perception, we now also have to include articulation in that, in this particular case, visual cues, to really come up with a representation in which we predict perception based on acoustic and articulatory properties. So I think my time is up, so I'll say Hamza Kamnida.